We are very fortunate this evening to have one of the leading experts on U.S. election law with us to help make sense of the U.S. election process and what we might expect going forward. Professor James A. Gardner is the SUNY Distinguished Professor of Law, the Bridget and Thomas Black Professor of Law, and Research Professor of Political Science at the State University of New York at Buffalo. He is the author of several acclaimed books on U.S. election law and multiple scholarly articles published in leading U.S. and international law journals. He has served as the Fulbright Visiting Research Chair in Constitutionalism and Federalism at McGill University, and as the Federalism Scholar in Residence at the European Academy Institute for Comparative Federalism. Professor Gardner received his undergraduate degree from Yale University and his Juris Doctor from the University of Chicago. Between 1984 and 1988, he practiced law with the United States Department of Justice. If you would, please join me in welcoming Professor James Gardner.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, and thanks so much to everybody for showing up by whatever means you're here. It's a great honor and a privilege to be able to address you tonight. And I have to say, you know, given the conditions, it would be wonderful, and I wish I could be there with you in person. But you know, the circumstances are what they are, and so this is the next best thing. I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you, and so let me say what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the legal structure of presidential elections, which is itself so complicated that it can take a while to explain it. So here I go. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so here's kind of the beginning, the basic facts here. The United States system for electing presidents is extremely complex. I'm going to do my best to see if I can make sense of it for you. But it's extremely confusing even to Americans. I would say most Americans really do not understand the system very well because of its complexity. One thing that makes it especially confusing and complex to modern Americans, and really to anybody around the world, is that the US system under modern conditions really contains an internal contradiction of a very serious nature. So citizens of modern democracies expect a majoritarian system of elections. That is to say that what they expect and what they demand is that the will of a majority of voters will control the outcome of an election, particularly when the election is not for a multiple person body like a legislature, but for the single chief executive of the country. And the fact is that the US system is not majoritarian, and as a result, it is possible to win the US presidency without acquiring a majority of voters nationwide. And this happened it's happened twice in my lifetime, and most recently in 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency, and yet collected 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. So before I try to show you the complexity of the system, I want to set the stage a little bit by talking about the reasons why it is so complex. And those reasons are largely historical. And there are three that I think are worth discussing. So first of all, the framers of the US Constitution, the people who wrote it, had a great fear of centralized power. They had just rebelled against the British Empire, and the British Empire was a highly centralized form of governmental organization in which all power was contained at the imperial center, and no real power and choice was devolved to the colonial possessions of Great Britain. And the framers of the US Constitution felt that Americans had been treated quite badly under the system, and that centralized power was the root cause of the problem. And James Madison, who was really the principal influence on the shape that the Constitution took at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, very famously wrote this sentence: the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. And what he meant by that was that the opportunity to act tyrannically arises when all power is centralized in a single set of hands. And when the opportunity arises, Madison believed that human nature was such that people would be unable eventually to resist, people who held all the power would be unable to resist using it tyrannically. And so the action that the framers took to prevent this possibility from arising was to disperse power very widely. So we have a horizontal separation of powers between the three branches of government, and we also have a vertical separation of powers between a national government and state governments, and that's the system of federalism. And federalism is, to a great extent, what makes our presidential elections so complicated, because the power to regulate federal elections is shared between the two levels of government. This is a very unusual arrangement worldwide. It might even be unique as far as I know. In most states around the world that hold elections, the power to regulate those elections is held by the level of government to which the elections will allocate people. But here it is shared between the two levels. The second historical reason for the complexity of the system has to do with the framers' distrust of democracy. So the men who wrote the US Constitution were men of their times. They were 18th century English gentlemen, really. They were elites, and they did not believe that ordinary people had the capacity to engage in the kind of self-government that democracy represents, or at least to do so in a way that is responsible and respectful to the rights of others. And so as a result, the Constitution quite drastically limited the direct role of the people, and that was believed by the framers to be a virtue of its design, not a defect. So the House of Representatives, you probably know, is selected by direct election by the people, but that's it. That's the only, under the original constitutional design, that was the only role that the people played in a direct democratic way. The Senate, members of the Senate were appointed by state legislatures. That's something that was amended in the early 20th century to allow direct election of senators. And then the president is selected not by the voters, but by members of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is this strange body which was intended to be a body of wise and virtuous and independent individuals who themselves, among themselves, would be much better equipped than the people to decide who should have the the great responsibilities of being the chief executive. And so as a result, in the United States, in a presidential election, voters do not actually cast their vote for the candidates who are running for president. They actually cast their vote for presidential electors who will then themselves vote in a process that I will explain. And the third historical reason for the complexity of the system is more recent history. So public attitudes about democracy have really gone in a very different direction than the attitudes held by the framers. In the United States, in the early 19th century, there was a long movement, really a pro-democracy movement, often associated with Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States in 1828 and 1832. And during this period, the beliefs of the public really changed quite dramatically. People came to believe that ordinary citizens do in fact have the capacity for democratic self-rule, and that political virtue is something that is possessed by ordinary people rather than solely the possession of social and economic elites. And in fact, during this Jacksonian democracy movement, public attitudes actually went even further to begin to believe, and this is, I believe, is a belief that is held today, that actually the people are more virtuous than politicians, that politicians are people you have to watch And the real source of virtue is the people. So there was, at the subnational level, at the state and local level, during this period, a drastic expansion of the popular role. So many more offices became elective. Why? Because the people began to demand the opportunity to choose their government officials. This included judges, which is something that is very unusual worldwide. So in the American states, most judges are elected. And then later, by the early 20th century, actual institutions of direct democracy, like initiatives and referenda, began to appear in some of the states, allowing the people not simply to directly select their rulers, but also for them to directly make policy choices essentially by legislating or amending their state constitutions through the electoral process. Okay, so if I were to summarize, so let me lay out the structure for you now. So if I were to summarize, I would say the constitutional structure of the authority to regulate federal elections can be described as very decentralized, with shared authority, shared at the state and federal levels. All right, so here we go. Hold on, I'm going to walk you through the structure of regulatory authority for federal elections. And although our topic today is presidential elections, just for purposes of comparison, let's start with congressional elections. Elections to Congress, the Congress of the United States, are regulated mainly by state law. This begins with the qualifications of voters. Under Article 1, Section 2 of the US Constitution, the states determine the qualifications of people to vote, not only in their own elections to state offices, but also for federal elections to Congress. States also under the US Constitution are given the authority expressly to regulate the time, place, and manner, those are the actual words of the document, the time, place, and manner of federal elections. Now, Congress is given the power to override state regulation of the time, place, or manner of federal elections. But this power historically has almost never been used. It's a little bit of a puzzle why Congress hasn't done more. It probably has to do with federalism and respect for state autonomy. Over our history, many members of Congress have felt for a lot of different reasons that it would be wrong for the federal government to intervene in state decisions concerning democracy. In any case, whatever the reason, Congress has almost never used this power. And so as a result, federal election law is really state election law for almost any significant purpose. Now, if we go to presidential elections, what we find is that the balance is tilted even more in favor of state power. That is, the sharing between the federal and state governments is even more tilted towards the states when it comes to presidential elections. So under Article 2, state legislatures are given the authority to decide how the state is going to choose its presidential electors. Those are the people who actually cast votes for president in the Electoral College. The states are not bound by the choice of method in any way, and most pertinently, they need not use popular election to select the state's presidential electors. And in fact, in the early history of the United States, many state legislatures simply appointed presidential electors directly without any kind of consultation with the people. During this Jacksonian period, that method became unpopular. And so by 1832, all but one state did use popular election to choose the presidential electors. So that is to say that the responsibility for choosing presidential electors for a state was switched from the state legislature to the people through a direct process. However, unlike in election to Congress, Congress does not have the regulatory power to override the state's choices about how to conduct the presidential election. This is really allocated almost entirely to the states. But Congress does have the power to regulate what happens after the states complete their role. And the states provide only the first step in a rather complex process. So what I'm going to do now is switch to laying out for you the actual process that is used under the US Constitution and federal law to select a president. And that is a process that has a minimum of 3 phases. It might, in some cases, it has in some cases have a 4th phase. So the typical 3 phases are state elections. It begins with elections in the state. That's the phase that we're still in right now, because the state election results still have not been completely tabulated in every state. Secondly, there's the Electoral College. This is where the identity of the president is actually decided in most cases. Then Congress has a role, and Congress's role is to count the electoral votes cast in the Electoral College. And usually it ends there. There is a 4th kind of backup system in case the Electoral College does not produce a majority winner. And that is then the House of Representatives chooses the president. This is a process established by the 12th Amendment to the US Constitution. All right, so let's look at these phases one by one. So state popular elections, this is what everybody hears about. This is what most people, and including most Americans, think is the only phase of presidential elections. They're wrong about that, but it is the first phase and it's the most publicly prominent. So during this phase, the states choose their presidential electors, and the number of presidential electors that a state has is roughly proportionate to its population, because there's a formula, and the formula is the number of electors a state gets is equal to the number of representatives it has in Congress, which is proportional to its population, plus 2, which is the number of senators that it has. And that's a result that gives a slight disproportionate advantage to the smaller states, but not one that is highly significant, I think. So these electors are chosen in 51 separate elections, 51 because the District of Columbia, which is not a state, also has the constitutional power to choose presidential electors. And I want to stress these are 51 separate elections. There is no nationwide vote for president. There is no nationwide voting on anything for any purpose in the United States. So these elections are held in the individual states, and they are conducted under state law. And here, to give you an idea of what it is that US voters actually see, I'm going to show you a couple of sample ballots. So this is a sample ballot from the election that just was held from Jefferson County, New York. This is a rural area about 200 miles north of New York City. And you can see that across the top are the different offices that people are voting for. And then down the side is the party of the candidates. And you'll notice here, this is actually quite transparent, because instead of saying that, or even implying that the vote you cast here is going to be for president and vice president, it does say this is a vote for presidential electors for these candidates. And so the Democratic, it's a vote for electors who will support the Democrat, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, or the Republican, Trump and Pence. And then you can see that a voter would go down the ballot and vote the rest of these offices. So here's a judicial office, here's a representative in US Congress, here's for the state Senate, state assembly, and so on. Here is a sample ballot from Texas from the last election. You can see it's very different in format, so you can get the idea that each state regulates its elections as it chooses, as it sees best. Here, the candidates go down the side. You can see that this is in English and Spanish. In New York, it's done differently. If you want a ballot in Spanish, you can request one, but the ballots themselves are not bilingual. And here the offices are listed across, or the parties are listed across the top. And here there is no indication that you're not voting for president or vice president, as there was in the New York ballot, where it said you're voting for electors for president and vice president. And so here are the candidates: Trump, Pence, Biden, Harris. And then again, there's other offices that were on the ballot in Texas. this past election. All right, so conducted under state law. There you can get a good view of what that means, one aspect of what that means for voters. After the voters vote in the state's electors are then awarded to the winner of the statewide popular vote. This is something that is provided by state law. And if there are any disputes, and this is what a lot of the recent news has been about, disputes over who actually won the popular vote and therefore who is entitled to the state's electors, state law provides the law under which these disputes are resolved. And there's basically two remedies that are available. One is a recount. Apparently, the Trump campaign has requested a recount in some parts of Wisconsin yesterday, which will be carried out. And then there is something called an election contest. This is a procedure that takes place most typically in a court. And in an election contest, a candidate or a political party or even a voter can challenge the results on a variety of different grounds. And those grounds most typically are, number one, that ballots were included which should have been excluded, or that ballots were excluded which should have been included, or there was some kind of procedural irregularity that somehow affected the result. But I do want to stress that remedies are available under these election contest laws only if the number of ballots or the irregularity that is being challenged has the possibility of changing the outcome. If it doesn't have the possibility of changing the outcome, the courts are not interested in hearing this kind of a challenge. And many of the Republican lawsuits that have been filed really did not have even the possibility of changing the result. And that's one reason that they were dismissed so readily. All right, that brings us to phase two, which is the Electoral College. The Electoral College begins with the choice of presidential electors in each state, following these 51 state elections. So it is decided who won, and electors are awarded to the candidate who won the popular vote, and then the presidential electors meet in their states and they cast the votes that actually determine the presidency. So they vote for their presidential candidate. In principle, under the US Constitution, presidential electors are free to vote for whoever they want. The Electoral College, as I mentioned before, was conceived to be a body of wise and virtuous elite citizens who possessed better judgment than the people might about who should be president. And so they are free to exercise their independent judgment. However, there is a very long practice going all the way back to the first US elections that the presidential electors vote for the winner of the state popular vote. And that is a practice that is enforced by party discipline. Who are these presidential electors? They tend to be officials of the political party of the winner of the election. So for example, I live in Buffalo, New York. That's a big city in Western New York. The mayor of Buffalo is a presidential elector pledged to Joe Biden. So it's people like that, people who are important officials in the party. And if an elector were not to vote for his own party's candidate, there would be a heavy price to pay within the party in terms of that person's political fortunes. Some states have tried to bind electors by law to vote for the winner of the popular vote. And those efforts were upheld just recently by the US Supreme Court. But there still is the problem of the so-called faithless elector, which is an elector who decides not to vote how they're supposed to vote, and instead exercises independent judgment. But this has happened very, very rarely in US history, and never in a way that had any possibility of affecting the outcome. Once the members of the Electoral College meet and cast their, I told you this was complicated, I wasn't kidding, meet and vote for the presidential candidate, they then report their results to Congress. And that reporting process and the meeting process of the electors is regulated by federal law. So we now move to the phase where state regulation ceases and federal regulation begins. The third phase, which is usually the last phase, is that Congress receives the electoral votes and then counts them, physically counts them. They're in envelopes, they open the envelopes, and they count the votes. This is a process that is established by the Constitution. I think what the Constitution had in mind was that this would be a very ministerial ritual. It would be more of a ritual of sanctifying the person, identifying and then conferring on this person the presidency in a way that would not involve the exercise of any congressional discretion at all. However, what has proven to be the case over our history is that disagreements in Congress during the counting process can arise over the validity of electoral votes that have been cast. And if a disagreement like that arises, then there is a process established by federal law, the Electoral Count Act, which was enacted in 1887 in the wake of a particularly messy and confusing presidential election. And what happens is this: if there are any objections to the counting of a state's electoral vote, those objections are resolved by the two houses of Congress, the House and Senate, meeting separately and then deciding how to resolve the objection. And if they agree either to include the votes or to exclude the votes, that's the decision. If they disagree, then it is a little bit unclear what happens. The most likely result would be that a state's electoral votes would then be excluded from the count, which I don't think has ever happened in US history, but it is at least a theoretical possibility. Right, okay, so there you go. And then the last phase, which is in almost every election we've ever had, the process has ended after the third phase, the congressional counting. But if that counting fails to produce a majority winner of the electoral votes, then the House of Representatives decides. Actually elects the president. This is under the 12th Amendment. And this has happened twice in American history, in 1800 and in 1824. It is a highly anti-democratic resolution of a process that Americans consider to be democratic, and it would be it would provoke, I think, quite a bit of a constitutional crisis if it happened in this election or in any modern election. When the members of the House of Representatives vote, they do not vote by individual member, but by state delegation. So ordinarily, when the House of Representatives votes, each member casts a vote, and that means that the most populous states have more of an influence on the result. But under the 12th Amendment, states vote, each state gets one vote, which neutralizes the population advantage of the large states. All right, so let me just give to conclude, let me give you an overview of the legal issues. And here that have arisen in this presidential election. Here I think it's very useful and important to distinguish between legal issues that arose before the election and legal issues that arose after and are arising after the election, because they're very different in character. Before the election, in the pre-election phase, the main disputes that reached the courts concerned what rules will apply during the election, during the voting, to the casting of votes. So there was a cluster of legal issues that concerned the eligibility of voters, and particularly centered on who will be registered to vote. In the United States, with the exception of North Dakota, you have to register to vote in order to be able to vote on election day. And so some states were, and these are all, I have to say, all states controlled by the Republican Party, started to require proof of citizenship. There were administrative actions to purge voter registration rolls on the theory that they were inaccurate and contained names of people who weren't eligible to vote. There were restrictions on voter registration drives. Another thing that's unusual about the electoral system in the United States is that the burden of registration is not placed on the state, it is placed on the voter. And one common way that voter registration occurs is when private organizations, NGOs, we might say, come into a state and try to register people to vote. Some states put restrictions on those voter registration drives, really for the purpose of dampening the degree of registration of new voters that occurs. A second set of legal issues before the election centered around the conditions of voting for eligible voters. So if you are an eligible voter, if you're registered, in what conditions will you vote? And so states, again, Republican-controlled states, almost exclusively, enacted strict voter ID requirements that required people to show some sort of photographic ID or some other form of documentation. There were measures to make voting less convenient, reducing the number of polling places, shortening the time available during early election periods. So a lot of states, to make it easier to vote, had allowed people to vote before election day, and those measures were cut back. And then there were the measures that were going to apply as a result of the pandemic. So would people be able to vote by absentee? What would be the conditions under which mail voting would occur? Or were people going to be forced to go to the polls and risk their health in order to cast a vote? But those issues were resolved before the election. So there was a huge amount of litigation, but those issues were resolved by election day. And so now we're in a phase involving post-election legal issues, and those issues deal with how to apply the rules that were decided in the pre-election phase. And the main issues of contention right now have to do with absentee or mail ballots, mostly due to the pandemic, because Americans are accustomed to going to the poll physically and casting their vote in a polling location. But because of the pandemic, many more people requested absentee votes or mail ballots. And so there was a lot of, so the issues now concern these mail ballots primarily. Did they arrive on time? Was any adjustment of the time, a regulatory adjustment of the time? Was it legal? Was it constitutional? Did the voters correctly fill out their ballots? It is more complicated to fill out a mail ballot than an in-person ballot because you have to provide more information. And was the voter eligible? So those are the main issues that have been resolved in the last couple of weeks. If we look ahead to what legal issues remain at the state level, so in the phase one of a presidential election, that's the state elections, really nearly all of these contests have been dismissed, and we're very close to having a final definitive count of the vote in every state. In the electoral college phase, there is conceivably this problem of faithless electors that I mentioned before, and I have heard that the Trump campaign is now trying to convince the presidential electors to defect from their party and to vote for Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden. I don't expect that to have any impact at all. Then we can get into a little bit of unknown territory when we get to Congress. Will objections be made in Congress to the electoral votes of certain states? And if so, how will those objections be resolved? If those objections cannot be resolved by agreement of the two houses, then it is possible that the election will go to the House of Representatives, in which case it's not yet clear exactly what the final results will be, but it appears that Republicans will control more states than Democrats, in which case that is a scenario in which Donald Trump could actually win the election. All right, so there you have it. That's the system.
Well, thank you, Professor Gardner, very much. That was highly educational, I assure you, for Americans as well as non-Americans. And in the United States, as all of you might expect, this has been consuming for the public and the news media ever since prior to the election, and the possible remaining issues suggest that we have several more weeks of attention to this that likely will occupy all of us here and much of the world in awaiting a firm and final outcome to the United States 2020 presidential election. But that was a hugely informative and beneficial lecture. And now it's time for questions. I think that we will start with the people in the room in 201. And we have a microphone to pass around, and then open it up to everyone. And you may send questions in by chat as well.
Professor Garland, thanks for your insightful sharing. I'm wondering about the dead word enroll, because I learned from CNN that the dead word enroll is not important, but from Fox News, it's very important and it's persuasive. And the date word is, there are many dead words around the United States. So what's your idea about it? Thank you.
You are asserting that dead people voted? Is that the question?
Yes, that's my question.
Yes, that is completely false. So how does something, so very interesting. So first of all, how does an idea like that even arise? It is true that in American history, there have been instances of deeply fraudulent elections in which devious election officials collaborated in a process in which votes by dead people will be cast. And so the city of Chicago actually is known. The truth of this even is, I think, unclear. But the city of Chicago is known as a place where in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, votes would come from a precinct that included a graveyard, and not from living voters. All right, so this does not happen anymore. There are measures in place to prevent it. All the states have procedures that makes it virtually impossible. And it is also something that can only occur with the fraudulent collaboration of election officials. And that just doesn't happen anymore. So this is something that happened in the distant past. And there is no evidence whatsoever, zero evidence that this has occurred in the 2020 election. And people who repeat that lie, which is what it is, have a political agenda for doing so that needs to be understood. And that agenda is an anti-democratic agenda. They're trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the people's actions.
I saw an interview on television the other day of a 91-year-old woman in Georgia who the Trump campaign had accused of voting while dead. So that gives you an idea of the credibility of some of the claims. More questions?
Hello, Professor Gardner, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have one procedural question about the electoral college. I wonder in a microscopic way, how do how do state citizens know their electors they're voting for, and how, for example, if I'm a citizen in one of the states, what's the route for me to become an elector do I have to, campaign around or something else? Could you, explain it in a more microscopic way as an U.S. citizen? Because for me, I don't know how the U.S. people really interact with their political representatives. So thank you.
That's a terrific question. Presidential electors are, the people do not vote for their own their party's presidential electors. Under state law, it is the political parties of the candidates who simply appoint presidential electors. And although the identity of these electors is publicly available, so you can go on a website of the New York Democratic Party or the California Democratic Party or the Texas Republican Party, and you can find out who those presidential electors are. But this information is not really publicized. And so most people do not know who are the actual presidential electors they're voting for. In fact, I think most Americans are under the wrong impression, that they are voting directly for a presidential candidate rather than presidential electors. So the way that you get to be appointed a presidential elector is you have to be a member of the political party, and you have to, I guess you just have to know the right people. It is largely a ministerial and it's sort of an honorary kind of an arrangement. It is a privilege to be elected, to be appointed an elector, and to have this opportunity to participate in a presidential election. But people who go into it don't go into it with the with the idea that, oh, I'm a wise, virtuous person, the people should choose me as a presidential elector. So nowadays it is quite subterranean and opaque as to who the electors are. Which is, again, contributes, I think, to the confusion in the public mind.
Here's a question from the remote audience dealing with, it's related somewhat to the issue of dead voters. States have different laws and regulations for purging voter rolls or eliminating ineligible voters. What is the typical rule for purging voter rolls? And to your knowledge, what is the most strict purging regulation currently in force?
Well, okay, good. There is one of the very few congressional interventions into the state election process occurred following the 2000 election, which, as you may know, ended up being decided by a ruling of the Supreme Court concerning the counting of votes in Florida. And what that election revealed was that many of the states have a very weak infrastructure for democracy. And one of the weaknesses of this infrastructure that was identified was that some states had a really very poor process for updating voter registration rolls. That is the list of people who are registered to vote in the state. And it was a weak infrastructure in that it was not regularly updated. So in the United States, so first of all, people die, new people are born, new people register, and then what happens to the people who die? They should be taken off of the voter registration rolls, but often there was no resources to do so, and they were simply left on the voter registration roll, which is one thing, by the way, that contributed to the rumor that dead people were voting. Congress passed this law called the Help America Vote Act, which did a number of things, and it gave states money to update their voting equipment, but it also required them to periodically update their voter registration rolls. So during some period of time, every couple of years or something, under this law, states have to review their voter registration rolls and update them to keep them as accurate as possible. And this is a difficulty because people move in and they move out of a state, and there is no really systematic nationwide process for tracking people when they move out of a state and then register to vote in a different state. So what happened was these state rolls became loaded with names of people who were no longer eligible to vote in the states. And this law required states to make them accurate on a periodic basis. Now, there was some variation, and there still is variation in the diligence and energy with which states pursue this goal. And in some states, again, these are states that typically are controlled by Republicans, some of the government officials decided to take a very, very aggressive view, and in fact, enacted procedures or applied procedures that were too aggressive, and began removing from the voter registration rolls names of people who actually still lived in the state and still were eligible to vote. And when this was discovered, it produced a great deal of litigation over what is the method that government officials may use to update and make accurate these rolls. There was, in particular, in the state of Ohio, there was a Secretary of State, that's the government official charged with maintaining the accuracy of the voter rolls, who was very, very aggressive about this. And in the period of 5 years, removed from the voter rolls more than 2 million names. It was later discovered that this action was filled with inaccuracies, and many, many eligible voters were taken off. And then you don't find out about that until you show up at the polling place and try to cast a vote. So it created a lot of problems.
Questions from room 201?
Hello. Hello, Professor. I noticed a very controversial act after the major battlegrounds outcome came out. The major US media cuts of President Trump's speaking during the live. So I wonder, how do you say about the media's roles during the US election? And I also noticed that Twitter put tags like officials called the election differently under President Trump's Twitter. So do you think the media should intervene that much during the election? Thank you.
Okay, that's a good question in a couple of ways. So one way is that you have identified another really important misconception that a lot of Americans have. So the media has no role in deciding who won an election. That is an official function that is performed by the state governments. And the state governments report unofficial results early in the process, but then they don't report their official results until they have actually physically counted all the ballots and reviewed the accuracy of their count, and then they announce who won the election. So what the media does is the media hires demographers and political scientists who are experts at projection, and then based on these unofficial results, they make, one hopes, well-founded projections about who won. And this is a public service that the media provides, but it is by no means an official function of the media. They do it because their viewers like to hear this information. So there's no official role there. It's a role that the media has chosen to occupy because its viewers like to hear this information and to know it as early as possible. But there's a second aspect of your question, which is more broadly the large role of the media in democratic elections generally nowadays. It's always been the case. So in the United States, we have a tradition, a constitutional tradition of referring to the media as the fourth branch of government: executive, legislative, judicial, and then the media. They're of course not a branch of government, but they do serve a function that without which it would be really very difficult for democracy to proceed, which is that they disseminate information. They disseminate information about the candidates. They disseminate information about their policy positions. They stage and then show debates. These are not official functions. They're all functions put together unofficially by private organizations, including media organizations. And so the media are the conduit by which Democratic voters get the information that they need in order to vote intelligently. So the media do play a very big role. What's changed in my lifetime is a result of the two things, the enormous fragmentation of the media and the enormous speed and really, I guess one might say democratization, although I'm not sure if that's the right word, but democratization of the media with the newish institution of social media. And when I was a kid, there were 3 television networks, and you could watch one of the 3, and that was where most people got their news, and you could read a newspaper. So that's how people got their information. Now there's a limitless source of information available. And you know, what's troublesome is that it is highly fragmented, so that people can choose, by choosing what media to consume, they can also choose the kind of political information that they hear. And one of the most worrisome things, I believe, is the fact that people choose to hear news that supports their own beliefs. They do not choose generally to receive information that challenges their beliefs. And so that makes the possibility of meaningful democratic debate and dialogue really reduced, which is a problem for a democracy. So yes, I would say sort of characteristics of the media environment have had an enormous influence on how democracy is actually practiced in the United States and everywhere else that it's practiced.
I'll ask a question from the remote audience that relates a bit to the media issue. And this person is saying, I heard on the news that President Trump advocated that certain extreme groups, such as the Proud Boys, work to stop the vote counting or interfere with vote counting. Is what Trump is doing in this regard within his rights as president?
Good, okay. Yes, I think he did. I think he did make that suggestion. So he did not say this overtly. So Mr. Trump is, although his statements on many occasions are wild and seem not very thoughtful, in some ways he does think about what he says, and so he never actually came out and directly said that some of his more violent supporters should use violence to support him, but that I think was clearly his implication. Is that something he is entitled to do? No, absolutely. So under the US Constitution, the President of the United States has essentially one role, and that is to, according to the words of the Constitution, to take care that the law is faithfully executed. That means the job of the president is to uphold the rule of law. And for Mr. Trump to suggest that violence should be used in a democratic election process is to urge the contrary. It is to urge the undermining of the rule of law, and that is completely contrary to the oath that a president takes when he assumes office.
One more remote question. I read that some of the post-election lawsuits are seeking to prevent the certification of an entire state's presidential election result unless the outcomes in certain counties are excluded from the vote total. Can you tell us a little bit more about these cases? if that's accurate?
I think that is accurate. The Trump campaign is getting a little bit desperate, I would say. So it's very useful here to compare the experience in 2000. You may have heard about what happened in the 2000 presidential election. This was the election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And it was very, very close. And as the results came in, it became clear that how Florida went, because of it's a very populous state, how its electoral votes went would actually end up deciding the election. And in Florida, the count was extremely close. After the initial count, only about 500 or 600 votes separated Bush and Gore out of maybe 6 million votes cast. So that's an enormously close election. And as a result, a sustained effort to include or exclude individual ballots. You know, so if the Gore campaign could have excluded 500 ballots for Bush, then Gore would win Florida and he would win the presidency. So that's sort of the context, the sort of the background of this kind of post-election litigation. It's usually a battle to include or exclude very specifically identified ballots for a variety of highly technical reasons. Now, the difference between 2020 and 2000 is that the margin between Biden and Trump is much, much wider. And in fact, Trump could succeed in switching the result in 1 or 2 states, and he still would not win the Electoral College vote. So as a result, the Trump campaign is resorting to, really in desperation, as I say, to arguments that would invalidate much larger groups of ballots. Because the margin is so large, thousands and thousands of ballots would have to be invalidated, and then even the votes for an entire state. So this is a kind of challenge that is very unlikely to succeed because of the large number of ballots that are involved, and because the background context is, it really won't change the result. So I don't really expect we're going to see much sympathy from the courts for these kinds of legal actions.
Okay, one more remote question. You mentioned that some states have tried to bind their electors to the result of the popular vote as a way of dealing with the possibility of faithless electors. Can you talk a little bit more about this process and whether this is becoming prevalent among states?
Yeah, it is a trend. So for example, in the 2016 election, which was the Trump-Hillary Clinton election, the last one, 3 presidential electors from the state of Washington, which was a state that was won by Hillary Clinton, did not vote for Hillary Clinton. They voted for Colin Powell, a Republican, although not the presidential candidate, clearly. And so the government of the people of the state of Washington said, this is not a good thing. You should be voting for who we choose. And so they enacted a law that imposed, which was at the time the strongest law in the country, which imposed a civil fine of, I believe, $5,000 on any elector who voted independently. And a bunch of states have adopted, maybe 16 or 17 states have adopted measures like this, which will impose a civil fine on a presidential elector and also strip them of their office after the fact if they don't vote for the winner of the popular vote. All right, so they can be fined after the fact. On the other hand, although the prospect of being fined may provide a further incentive for presidential electors to vote faithfully rather than faithlessly, it still can't stop them from voting faithlessly if that's what they choose to do. So, you know, for me, these measures are, you know, window dressing. I don't think they accomplish very much. I've always thought that the real discipline that's imposed on electors is, as I said, discipline imposed by their parties, because they want to have a future in their political party. And if they don't vote for their own party's candidate, that's the end of their future in that political party.
Any more questions from room 201? If not, I'll ask the last question from the remote audience. And this is a question, this is kind of a twofold question, which doesn't really turn on your expertise, which is very deep on US elector law, but just on your impressions. What is the implication of the nomination of conservative Justice Barrett if Biden takes the presidency? And why do you believe Biden chose Harris as his running mate for vice president?
Well, the second one I think is a lot easier to answer. I think Biden chose Harris in order to, okay, there's a practice in the United States of creating, in a sense, a package of executive candidates. So the president and the vice president, since, well, not in the original Constitution, but since the 12th Amendment, the president and the vice president have run together as a team. And so there has become a practice arose of trying to build a team of president and vice president that had the widest possible attraction of an electoral variety. So the widest possible attraction to the widest number of voters. And early in our history, often that was accomplished by achieving what was called regional balance on the ticket, which is the name given to the president and vice president. So if the presidential candidate was from the East, the vice presidential candidate should be from the South or the Midwest or the West. Today, region is not nearly so important in the United States as maybe more identity characteristics. And so the choice of Kamala Harris was clearly an attempt to broaden the appeal of a white man to include Blacks and other racial minorities and women. So that was I think, largely a tactical consideration, considering that Biden had many, many very qualified people. I don't want to say that Kamala Harris is not qualified. She's highly qualified. I actually like her better than Joe Biden even, but I think it was tactical. Okay, as to the Supreme Court appointment, what's going to be the result of this? It's very, very difficult to say. There is another kind of tradition in American government, which is that once judges reach the US Supreme Court, sometimes they suddenly become independent-minded and don't necessarily vote the way that the president who appointed them expects that they will vote. So it's always very hard to predict how someone will behave on the Supreme Court based upon their behavior in a lower court. But generally, that has not happened. Generally, presidents have been able to predict fairly well. So she will be a conservative judge. She will join the conservative bloc of the Supreme Court, I would expect. But you know, it would be very speculative to try and figure out how she would vote on particular issues.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me close this evening with two comments. One is, first, thank you very, very much to Professor Gardner. I mean, he is one of the most prominent and leading experts on election law in the United States, and we've been able to see why in his lecture this evening. So we thank him very, very much for sharing his expertise and sharing his time. He's had a very early morning with us, and he has the rest of his day at work. I don't know how effectively we can applaud on Zoom, but let's give it a try. So thank you, Professor Gardner.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you.